I want to go back in time and talk about how we got to the place we are today, because I don't think either side of this struggle is being entirely honest about the situation. So, the situation in Ukraine is basically a civil war. It started, we had protests right before 2014. There was a coup that happened in 2014 that ousted, at that time, was an elected governor that was pro Russia. The coup folks were nationalists. There were many neo-Nazi elements that came in from the militia side. Complex situation. So that's basically what happened then. Now we're in a situation where we actually have a Jewish president. So there's that going on. And yes, some of the same elements are still there as far as the far right is concerned. But this is also true of the Russian side. A lot of people don't want to talk about the fact that you had neo-Nazis that were foreign that came and fought on the Russian side as well. So it's complex. So let's start basically, though, at the beginning. What were those protests about 2013, around that time before we had the coup?
I mean, at the base level, they were about, it was a perception that the Ukrainian government at the time was extremely corrupt. And while elements of that are probably true, it appears that the U.S. and outside forces were meddling in the Euromaidan movement long before it flared up into what you could describe as like an actual civil war.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting is the amount of, I mean, I would describe it as U.S. intelligence friendly, at the very least, media that was not just embedded with Ukrainian militias and such, but also just on the ground. Like right when Euromaidan was flaring up, there was so much coverage here from U.S. Western press, specifically, oddly, Vice News,
Right.
that it took on this sort of different character than other places that we've meddled in, where the amount of media coverage coming from the West and spin about it, just at the beginning of Euromaidan was pretty impressive. How well oiled of a propaganda machine it was coming from the sort of the Western media side. And then you even had the origin of people like Tim Pool, who's now sort of a libertarian alt media celebrity who was basically doing State Department stenography for Vice News in Ukraine. And he even did a Reddit AMA about it later on. So you had a lot of weird things happening there. You had also things that are hard to prove, but are sort of easy to perceive when you look through all the video clips of Euromaidan, for example. The amount of, let's just say, perfectly assembled shields, body armor, and wooden poles that were distributed among the protesters was, again, very, very impressive. It's the type of stuff you hear about right-wingers, sort of spinning paranoid narratives about here with Antifa, but it actually happened in Ukraine. I mean, you can see it very clearly. Suddenly everybody has the same size wooden poles, shields, able to just overcome any, police they encountered there. Pretty impressive feat. It's still, it's a little vague in terms of like, how do we know exactly what the U.S. did there to meddle? But what we do know that the U.S. did is that Victoria Nuland, who was basically the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, took on this sort of new position where she was sort of the face of the Eastern European representation of the State Department during the Obama administration. And she was essentially caught on a leaked phone call playing musical chairs with the Ukrainian opposition. Like, well, who should we get in there? Like, what about this guy? Well, he's not great. I like this guy better. And then what's his face? I forgot his name. It's the other guy who was actually in the Ukrainian embassy. He's like, well, what the UN, the EU is not going to like that. And Victoria Nuland's infamous comment, "Fuck the EU," basically saying that like the EU is going to like trust Russia a little too much in this situation. So like, fuck the EU. It's like, we know what's up. We're the US. We do what we want. And that became sort of an infamous flashpoint where it was like the U.S. started accusing Russia of playing information war, leaking the phone call on purpose, which they probably did. And then that sort of created a whole new version of information warfare between Russia and the United States, where it sort of created this new track where things started to get very meta, with the way that the propaganda became. You started to have organizations like Bellingcat come onto the scene, which were, heavily trying to imply that Russia shot down MH17 and then try to lie about it. And it was actually the Russian separatists who use a Buk. And here's, all these satellite photos of the Buk. It's like, how is this, private organization, Bellingcat, basically acting as if they're an intel agency, being the ones to prove to the public that Russia shot down this plane. It was very strange. But basically, several years later, it at least it seemed to me that the situation had largely died down, in the sense that there wasn't sort of this increasing energy towards, we need to do something about Ukraine. It seemed as if the Obama administration had sort of dialed that down towards the end of their presidency. The Trump administration, even though they broke all these extremely important treaties with Russia, including like one of the most important nuclear treaties ever, you didn't see an increase in that energy during the Trump administration, which I thought was a hopeful sign. And then all of a sudden, when Biden gets in, again, it seems like, well, maybe this is not going to be the situation it was under Obama. And then all of a sudden, it seems like we've sort of taken this turn where very quickly the situation is now kind of rhetorically at its most escalated level ever, which is probably the scariest part to me. But on the other hand, you don't have the well-oiled propaganda machine that was coming from the West like you did back in 2014. It seems a little sloppier. It seems more rushed. It seems like the situation came much more quickly. So that's my only hope here, that maybe because there's a lack of this organization and coordination, it's not as dangerous. But at the same time, the sort of hastiness of it, the speed of it, the sloppiness of it, is also scary. So it's kind of, I have mixed feelings about it.
There's two factions inside Ukraine, and nobody is talking about this more or less. It's always Ukraine as a united front versus Russia, right? That's sort of the language that's being used. When in reality, there is a group of what is now Russian separatists, right? Originally, they weren't separatists. They were part of Ukraine, but now they've become separatists. They're the eastern side of the country, right? So the accusation that I've seen being made, for example, by Bellingcat and others, is that those are Russia-appointed leaders in the eastern part of Ukraine, right? So they're talking about them in this sort of this versus them kind of dialogue. What do you make of that?
Well, that's when things get, I don't live in Ukraine. I don't know very many Ukrainians personally, so things, get a little murky. It's like they're playing on the ignorance of Westerners, and sometimes it's very effective. A similar spin was put on the sort of the Crimea referendum. I have personally mixed feelings about that referendum, and I sort of always have. I mean, there always was sort of an argument, especially within left anti-imperialism, that was like completely above board, that the vote was completely fair, and that
Right.
everybody wanted to go back to Russia. I mean, that narrative has always sat with me a little bit uncomfortably, because it's like, I mean, we got to just be realistic that, Russia has had the U.S. breathing down its neck in terms of this geopolitical, NATO maneuvering. And of course, Russia is going to, do things back to the U.S. I mean, one of the big accusations, this is one of the weirdest things to me about this, what's happening right now, Tina, is this idea that Russia is about to invade Ukraine. You keep hearing Biden, he just said that in a press conference right before we started. But what's interesting is the Obama's administration's approach to this was that Russia had already invaded Ukraine, doing something they described as hybrid warfare, where Russian separatists were Russian troops. This was their accusation, that Russian troops were pouring over the border, pulling off their insignias and pretending to be Ukrainian Russian separatists. Right. That was the narrative for 5 years. So That's it's strange to me that the White House would now be like throwing that narrative out and being like, well, now the Russians are going to invade with real troops. I'm surprised that
those were fake troops before.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised that Biden's not just, if he was following the line from Obama, he'd be like, Russia has already invaded Ukraine. We've already known they've been doing hybrid warfare. So I guess what's notable about that to me is it's a change in the script. For some reason, that's not as big or important as a talking point for them now. And they want to make it seem like it's more of a traditional, old school, like the Hitlerization of Putin, like he's about to invade. He's got all these troops and he's about to just run roughshod with his troops into Ukraine. That, I mean, if any of that's true about Putin doing that hybrid warfare stuff, which I think maybe part of it is true.
I think part of it's true. I think
I just think it's very unlikely.
Side and the truth, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's very unlikely that Putin would do something like this drastic now. Yeah. It seems very, very hyperbolic. And when you mix in the rhetoric from the US government and the Russian government, both accusing each other of staging false flags to try to initiate some kind of conflict, that's when you have to sort of take pause and be like, wow, this is getting really meta and bizarre. And even an AP reporter, you know, calls out, I think it was Jake Sullivan, of being like InfoWars. And I think that's when it's really reached a strange level, you know, like when a reporter just calls out a Biden official. It's sounding like Alex Jones. So
thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern time.